Welcome to Risky Bitness, where we don't just play games, but we also drill down into the tech that makes them what they are. This is episode 2 of our Neo Geo series. In our last episode, we took a deep dive into the Neo Geo hardware to see what all that beautiful technology can do. If you want to know why these games look, play, and sound as good as they do, be sure to check out that episode as well. Today we'll look at one of the most famous series on the console, the flagship fighting series Fatal Fury. If you're enjoying Risky Bitness, would you kindly like, subscribe, and ring that bell to help me keep on producing more gaming videos. If you have any suggestions, requests, comments, or corrections, please sound off in the comments. I would love to hear what you have to say. Now, I love fighting games. This is probably at least in part due to my lifelong love of the martial arts. I've practiced some form of martial arts or another for over 20 years, though not consistently. So, it should be no surprise that I used to play any fighting game I could get my hands on, and this included the original Fatal Fury, which I played on the Super Nintendo. Yes, I would later learn that the Super Nintendo version of Fatal Fury was a weak port of the original, which, if we're being honest, looks like a weak imitation of Street Fighter 2. But nevertheless, I loved it, because SNK fighting games weren't really popular in the US at the time. A little more on that later. I didn't have much exposure to the rest of the series until I discovered emulation many years later, and played the original Fatal Fury as it was meant to be played. Well, almost. I don't think SNK designed the game with the Gravis PC gamepad in mind. That kicked off an undying love of SNK fighting games, and that love is what brought me here today to tell you all about Fatal Fury. This is part 1 of 2 of my series on Fatal Fury. The next one will be coming next week. Enjoy. The story of Fatal Fury begins with Street Fighter, also known as Garo Densetsu, or the Legend of the Hungry Wolf in Japan. The original Fatal Fury was created by Takashi Nishiyama, who developed the original Street Fighter for Capcom. Not the legendary and super successful Street Fighter II The World Warrior that we all know and love, but rather its much less successful predecessor, which was a virtually unplayable mess. But he viewed Fatal Fury as the spiritual successor to that mess. This was not the first time that SNK had developed a game to rival Capcom's one-on-one fighting game. In 1989, they released Street Smart, which played a little more like a one-on-one version of a beat-em-up. Apart from the player characters being either dark-haired or blonde-haired men in a gi, it had little to do with the game it was imitating. It was a fun game, but it missed the mark in a really big way. Fatal Fury, however, spawned a number of sequels and also served as the basis of the King of Fighters series, which would dethrone it as the flagship franchise later. Fatal Fury spawned a number of sequels and spin-offs over the course of 9 years, before the franchise was finally retired. Due to the number of games and unusual titles, the Fatal Fury series can be a little confusing. Not quite as confusing as Street Fighter 2 or Assassin's Creed 2, but pretty confusing nevertheless. For this video, and the second part, I'll be focusing on the Neo Geo releases and only the main canon games. So I won't be talking about any side stories, ports, or alternate games, just the main games in the series. Today, we'll be looking at Fatal Fury, Fatal Fury 2 and Fatal Fury Special, and Fatal Fury 3. And next time we'll talk about Real Bout Fatal Fury, Real Bout Fatal Fury Special, Real Bout Fatal Fury 2, and Garo Mark of the Wolves. A number of ports of each of these titles was released, and we'll talk very briefly about the ports, but we won't be going into any kind of granular detail there. Without further ado, let's talk about Fatal Fury 1. Fatal Fury 1 was subtitled King of Fighters, and while it looks like an imitation of Street Fighter 2 with a cast of characters that clearly includes White Ryu, American Zangief, and Ken in a trucker hat, the games were actually released around the same time in 1991. A fun fact, there is a stage in the game that is called Sound Beach, and I actually used to live in a place called Sound Beach, but there was an astonishing lack of superpowered fighters duking out in the streets out there, which was very disappointing for me after I played this game. Like most fighting games, Fatal Fury is about a fighting tournament called the King of Fighters, which is run by an organized crime syndicate. The brothers Bogard fight to avenge the death of their father 10 years earlier at the hands of Geese Howard, who is every bit as sinister as his name would imply. The Bogard brothers are Terry and Andy, Terry in the trucker hat, and Andy the Ken clone, pretty much. And their friend Joe Higashi, who is a Muay Thai fighter, definitely not to be confused with Adonis Agat. Fatal Fury has 3 gameplay modes, a single-player story mode, and a 2-player versus mode, or a 2-player co-op mode, in which 2 players can team up against a single opponent. The single-player mode plays out in typical fighting game fashion, but unlike the much more successful Street Fighter II, the player can only select from the 3 hero characters, Andy, Terry, or Joe. There are 7 other characters who cannot be selected. During the game, you only fight against the 7 villain characters. The heroes do not fight against each other, except in the 2-player versus mode. When the game begins, after you select a fighter, you get to choose which of the 4 starting opponents you would like to take on first. Once you finish the best 2 out of 3 rounds fight, you move through the enemy fighters in order, with the one you chose removed from the rotation. After the first 4 are defeated, you'll face the 3 boss characters, Raiden, Billy, and Geese himself. These fights are much more difficult and intentionally unbalanced. These fighters do heavy damage, and it is very difficult to block their attacks. While today's fighting games are very complex, Fatal Fury is far from it. It's from a simpler time when we didn't worry about things like priority, frame data, hitboxes, meter. We didn't use weird phrases like meaties and footsies. You can do some kind of zoning in this game, but it's mostly based on timing, and the overall gameplay feel is more like a single-player experience in the vein of Punch-Out. Once you figure out each boss's weakness, they become much easier to contend with. For example, Raiden is completely vulnerable after spitting his mist. All of the enemies have special powers that seem a little unfair, however. A fun note, Raiden is based on the pro wrestler Vader. Very, very famous in Japan. Fatal Fury controls much like your typical fighting game, if your typical fighting game had awful controls. On the 4-button Neo Geo cabinet or stick, A is punch, B is kick, and C is labeled as technique, which is a really weird way of saying throw. And that's it. Throws are handled differently from other fighting games. It was a little ahead of its time there. The dedicated throw button causes your character to attempt a throw animation, and if the opponent is within range, you throw him. If you do not have an opponent in range, your character actually does the exact same animation of the throw, which leaves you open and vulnerable to attack. Another unique feature to Fatal Fury is that there are 2 lanes, so players cannot change lanes at will. But when the enemy changes lanes, you can use the stick to jump or roll into the same lane, or press the attack button to do a jumping attack onto their lane. This initiates a joust-like minigame where the person with the better timing scores a knockdown. Just like in many classic fighters, you can become dizzy during a fight, and of course there's always some trash talk afterwards. But in Fatal Fury, it's followed by a very brief cutscene of Geese getting all bent out of shape over how you're beating up all his guys. Special moves are all over the place. Unlike Street Fighter II, which had characters whose entire moveset was based on charging the joystick or rotating it, Fatal Fury's characters all have a mix of the 2. This can make the gameplay feel really awkward. When I want to use Terry's rising tackle or crack shoot, I feel like I have to rewire my brain for a second, and it really messes with my sense of rhythm. After every other match, a bonus game can be played, and there are 2 types of bonus games. One is arm wrestling and the other is board breaking. The board breaking is rather easy. You simply control your character, as you would during a regular fight, and you hit the boards that the on-screen characters are holding for you. Just like real board breaking, this is totally pointless. The other minigame is an arm wrestling game where you can lock up with a pro wrestler like Schmolk Schmogan or Schmock from the Legion of Shroom. To win the arm wrestling game, you have to press the A button over and over as fast as possible. Oh, what a rush, brother. Like most early Neo Geo games, the graphics have a cartoonish quality, but pixels are very large and colorful. Special effects are colorful as well, and there are some great scrolling effects used. The multiple planes take advantage of the Neo Geo zooming capabilities. However, I would say that there are definitely other games out there from the time that looked a little better than Fatal Fury. Still, some effects like strobing lights, weather and time of day changes, really nice touches that you don't see much of the time. Even the background characters have a pretty high level of detail, though I don't think it rivals games like Street Fighter II or Mortal Kombat in that area. Fatal Fury makes good use of the Neo Geo sound capabilities by including voice acting for the anime-style special move shouts. The music is good and nice and bassy, but there aren't that many tracks that are particularly memorable or really stand out. However, there are some great crushing sound effects that really give the hit some weight. Have a listen.
Round one. Round two.
I really liked Fatal Fury when I first played it. It's not Street Fighter 2, but it's got some unique features that were underappreciated at the time. And I have to say, Terry's Burning Knuckle just always feels super satisfying to land every single time. Fatal Fury was ported to the Neo Geo CD, Sega Genesis, Sharp 68K, Super Nintendo, PlayStation 2, Wii Virtual Console, and Nintendo Switch. Now let's move on to Fatal Fury 2 and Fatal Fury Special, which are basically the same game. Fatal Fury 2 was designed by Takashi Tsukamoto and produced by Ekichi Kawasaki. It was released in December 1992, about 9 months after Street Fighter 2 Champion Edition, and it was well received by critics, received a number of ports. The game was called Legend of the Hungry Wolf 2: The New Battle in Japan. Fatal Fury Special is an upgraded version of Fatal Fury 2, so we will be discussing both games here. So think about Fatal Fury Special to Fatal Fury 2 as Super Street Fighter 2 to Street Fighter 2. Geese Howard died at the end of the first Fatal Fury, so it only stands to reason that a mystery man would host a new King of Fighters tournament because he's looking for the man who defeated Geese. The new end boss is the character Wolfgang Krauser. Fatal Fury 2 is a really big upgrade from the original Fatal Fury. Instead of a single punch and kick button, you now have light and heavy punch and kick. And the dedicated throw button is gone. You can now throw the opponent using the hard punch button when up close. Backdashes were also introduced, some special move inputs have been changed, most notably Andy Bogart's moveset, which he would retain through the SNK fighting games that he appears in from here on out, including the quarter circle back for the fireball, and the quarter circle forward for the air counter uppercut move. Very much like a Shoto character. Players could now move freely between the two planes, and even knock the opponent into the other plane. Some stages have breakable items, and on one stage you can even knock bystanders down when switching back and forth. Some stages have obstacles in the background, so you can't change lanes, but you can knock the opponents into those obstacles. Another feature that makes the game feel a little bit non-competitive and really unfairly balanced. Pressing the hard punch button from far away results in a taunt. Counterattack can be performed right after a block, and desperation moves can be performed when the life bar is flashing red. So this is the first appearance of super moves in a Fatal Fury game. There's no meter, but when your life meter's red, you can do a super move. Pressing the, It's also possible to string together some combos, though there is no actual combo system in place, so it's really by accident. Players can now select from 8 characters, but the 4 boss characters are still unplayable. Raiden has been renamed to Big Bear for some reason, and SNK fans may recognize this as the first appearance of Kim Kapuan and Mai Shiranui. You can also choose your first opponent just like in the previous game, but the rest are selected in random order. The bonus stages are brick and column breaking stages, and you have objects to break on both planes you can move back and forth between and break those objects for the bonus stages. Fatal Fury 2 definitely took some notes from the World Warrior, adding a worldwide map screen before each fight, rather than the Southtown map from the first game. Now, what's so special about Fatal Fury Special? Fatal Fury Special added 4 boss characters from Fatal Fury 2, plus Duck King, Tung Fu Aru, and Geese Howard as playable characters. The character select screen now looks like a proper character select screen with a grid-based layout of the characters to choose from, rather than a group of full character models sitting in a room together. A combo system was introduced, very similar to what we're used to in Capcom's Mega Hit, and you can now do a high or low attack when moving between planes, making it even more like Joust. Yo Sakazaki from Art of Fighting is a hidden character in this game, but I was not able to find him because I'm just not very good. You have to win, I think, 5 fights without losing a single round, and I really just can't do that. I feel like it's much easier to employ modern fighting game concepts here, like zoning and footsies, and Andy and Terry feel a lot more like Shoto characters now. Bosses are still broken and ridiculous, and Billy Kane is virtually unbeatable, so I think by this time the legendary broken fighting game boss mechanic was absolutely in full swing. Definitely can't have bosses that you can beat without throwing a few bucks into the machine first. Fatal Fury 2 introduces updated graphics that are still based on the cartoon look of the original, but with more detailed character models. The color palette hasn't changed much. It's not a huge update, but it is noticeable. And Fatal Fury Special doesn't really seem to be all that different in terms of graphics, but why don't you take a look and let me know what you think in the comments. I can't say much has changed about the sound. It's still great arcade sound, but it's not a huge improvement over the original Fatal Fury. The same is true with Fatal Fury 2. It's good, but not great. There's no Guile theme here or anything that you're going to be walking away with in your head. This may be an unpopular opinion, but I really prefer the 4-button fighting game layout over the 6-button style of Street Fighter. It's much simpler. It's also much easier to play on a gamepad, which I prefer over a joystick, though some of the special moves in Fatal Fury are really hard to do with a D-pad. This is my favorite Neo Geo button layout, with A and C for punching and B and D for kicking. I think that's the perfect fighting game setup for Neo Geo. Fatal Fury 2 and Fatal Fury Special were ported to the Super Nintendo, Sega CD, Game Gear, PC Engine, Sharp X68K, and PlayStation 2. Our final game for today is Fatal Fury 2, Road to the Final Victory, Garo Densetsu 3. Road to the Final Victory. Fatal Fury 3 was designed and published by Takashi Tsukamoto and Takahisa Yarayama. It was released to arcades in March of 1995, a year after the greatest fighting game ever made, Super Street Fighter II Turbo. Fatal Fury 3 features a fully animated and voiced introductory cutscene, as well as customized trash talk both before and after rounds that is supposed to reveal parts of the story. If you're into King of Fighters, you will recognize this game as the first appearance of series staple Blue Mary. Taking place 3 years after Terry defeated Wolfgang Krauser, he hears a rumor that Geese Howard is still alive and teams up with his allies to investigate. But there's also some business about scrolls. It's all window dressing to the fighting action, and the game itself does a pretty poor job of explaining it, but let's be honest, we're not here for a story, we're here to hit people. In this installment, they revamped the 2-plane fighting system into a 3-plane one, but you can't fight in the background or foreground. All the action takes place in the middle lane, with the background and foreground used to quickly evade and counter attacks. 3D attacks are no longer air jousts, but rather quick moves that do not score a knockdown most of the time. If you stay in a lane for a few seconds, you will automatically be moved back to the middle. Some stages do not have 3 lanes. Air guard and air combos can now be used, and special moves can cancel into other specials. It's funny talking about that now in a time when cancels are a base level element in a fighting game, but this was 1995. It was pretty much unheard of then. The combo system also includes standing auto combos, which are a really nice touch over the more timing-based stop and start type play of the previous entries. And some of the returning characters, like Andy and Terry, have new special moves that you couldn't do before. There's still no super meter, but like Fatal Fury 2, super moves can be performed when the player's health bar is flashing red. There are even hidden critical super moves that have a 1 in 1024 chance of occurring when a special move is used, giving Fatal Fury 3 a Hearthstone-like level of competitiveness. After each battle, you will receive a grading based on your performance, a feature that's now common in fighting games but was an innovation at the time. You can choose from any of the non-boss characters, but the characters select screen has gone from a proper player select screen back to a portrait of available characters standing around. It looks good, but it's a little bit messy. You can choose your first opponent like the other games in the series, but after that the game takes control. There are also storyline battles that take place during arcade mode up until you meet the ridiculously broken boss characters. Then your fighting level determines which end boss you will face. The map character models are a really nice touch here. Anime-inspired chibi-type characters litter the map as you proceed through the game. Overall, Fatal Fury 3 feels much more like a serious fighting game than any previous game in the series. Techniques like zoning, footsies, and punishing a whiff with a combo have much more depth here. It's definitely a noticeable improvement in graphics, and while it retains the manga cartoon style of earlier entries, the sprites look more detailed. The backgrounds look amazing with lots of movement and changes between weather and time of day. The opening cutscene is really impressive too. I feel like there are a lot more catchy tracks here than before, and the overall sound is perfect for a fighting game. Every crunch, pow, and oof feels heavy and meaningful. Have a listen. Fatal Fury 3 is my favorite game in the Fatal Fury series, and for me it's where it really reached its zenith. The controls and fighting systems really came together to create one of the best fighting games of its era. While today it is overshadowed by the King of Fighters series, it is one of the best fighting games on the Neo Geo. I'm not sure if I agree with the common criticism that the multiplane fighting system was worn out its welcome. I think it's a staple of the series and it wouldn't be Fatal Fury without it. On the other hand, it does feel like a cheap gimmick that was forced in since the game is so strong even without it. Fatal Fury 3 has been ported to the Neo Geo CD, Sega Saturn, Windows, Wii Virtual Console, PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. Thank you for watching part 1 of our Fatal Fury episode of Risky Bitness. I want to grow this channel, but I can't do it without you. If you want to see more, please burn knuckle that subscribe button, rising tackle the thumbs up, and crack shot the bell. If your meter's full, light up that comment section. More likes, comments, and subscribers means more time and resources will be available to me to make better content for you, including more research and writing time, more editing time, and better equipment to make these videos with, like a microphone that doesn't pick up every background sound in the neighborhood. Next week, we'll be back with part 2 of our Fatal Fury coverage, where we'll talk about the Real Bout series and Garo Mark of the Wolves. Thanks again, and until next time, game over.